What I'm going to try to do this morning, good morning everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to define dignity from a Jewish perspective, and I'll be looking at it from a very traditional or orthodox perspective. So those who are here who are Jewish who may not be orthodox, you may not agree with everything I say, that's okay. I mean, we all have different ways of looking at things, but I'm going to define it from a traditional perspective and then look at it in the context of end-of-life care, because that's really my area of expertise. So if we look at the first slide, I always like to define things, at least loosely. You just heard a lot of definition about dignity, but the Oxford English Dictionary just tells us briefly that dignity is the quality of being worthy, honorable, worthiness, worth, nobleness, excellence, those kinds of things. And in Judaism, the term that's used and this really is in the Talmud, which is later Jewish literature, not scriptures itself, is kavod habriot, which translates as honor of the created or creations. Because even though it shares those characteristics, kavod means honor, so honor, worthiness, and so forth. The main thrust of dignity in Judaism is that it's derived from man's stature both as a creation of God and further as being created in the image of God, which raises man's stature above that of the rest of the animal kingdom, which are also creations of God. But the difference here is that man is also created in the image of God, and therefore that gives it that extra status in dignity. Dignity in Judaism looks at not only physical dignity in terms of body cleanliness and so forth, but also non-physical issues, including things like self-respect, societal status, and other things which I don't really have time to delve into in any depth. The next slide will show that the concept really comes from the Babylonian Talmud, the first tractate Brachot. 19b is the page that it's on. And there's a rabbinical discussion there about a case that while out in public, there was a person who realized he was wearing a garment that contained a mixture of wool and linen. And if you know from scriptures, that's forbidden to wear. It says in Leviticus that it's forbidden to wear any cloth that has a mixture of wool and linen. It's called shatnez. And so the ruling in the Talmud first says that the clothing must be removed immediately, even though the individuals will suffer significant embarrassment. And the rabbis bring down from Proverbs to support that, chapter 21, verse 30, there is no wisdom, understanding, or counsel against the Lord. Now, then it goes on to discuss this, argue it, bring other cases that try to refute that. And one of the things that's brought down is what's called the brisa, which is a rabbinical saying or ruling that didn't make the written, what we call the written oral law, the Mishnah or the Talmud, rather the Mishnah, but is sometimes expressed in the Talmud. And this brisa says that human dignity, kavod habriot, is so great that it supersedes a negative commandment of the Torah. So you have these almost two conflicting statements appearing within the discussion of the Talmud, and in a couple of slides you'll see how that all works together. So now the next I want to show some examples of kavod habriut or dignity in Jewish law that are practical, that show up in scriptures. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 to 23 talk about capital punishment in Jewish law. And one of the things that's talked about is after somebody's executed for capital crime, God commands that the body be hanged. However, the rabbis go on to tell you that the body is immediately taken down and buried, since it would violate, in a sense, God's dignity to have his image, since man is created in God's image, to have the image of God hanging there and becoming deformed and not appropriate. So therefore, one is commanded to, even though you hang the body, to immediately take it down and bury the body because of the dignity of the human body having been created in God's image. This is so powerful. This, by the way, doesn't apply only to Jews, it applies to non-Jews as well. If you look in the book of Joshua, in chapter 10, it talks about Joshua's and the Israeli, the children of Israel, the army, defeating 5 of the Canaanite kings, and Joshua commands that they be hung after they're executed. But then, again, they're taken down and buried before the sun goes down because it's undignified to have those bodies hanging up there for a long period of time. Another way dignity expresses itself in the Bible is also in Deuteronomy, verses somewhat earlier, 21 verses 1 to 3, which talks about what happens when you find a lost object. You're walking in the street, you see a lost object, you are obligated to retrieve it, and there's a whole process by which you have to attempt to restore that to the person who lost it. It includes going out and announcing it in public and so forth. The Talmud goes on to tell us that an elderly sage is exempt because it is beneath his dignity to have to go and pick up this object and take it out and announce about it. So here's where a status will override, in a sense, the law that one has the obligation to pick up a lost object and try to restore it. So we go next, we can see that, again, these two verses that I talked about that were in the Talmud from Proverbs 21:30 and the Brisa about human dignity are conflicting. How does Jewish law resolve that? Again, without going into all of the machinations, what's interpreted here is that Jewish law will supersede dignity if there's an active transgression of a Torah commandment. In other words, if the only way dignity would be accomplished would be to actively violate a rule or a law, you can't do that. Then the law supersedes dignity. On the other hand, if there's a situation in which the law can be passively unfulfilled, like here the elder who is not obligated like everybody else is to pick up that object because it's beneath his dignity. He's not doing anything. He's just not doing something. Then dignity may be used to supersede that under certain circumstances. There are other situations, if it's accidental, if it's a law that's not universally binding, or occasionally related to financial matters. So there's where dignity may, and I use the word may because not always is it still allowed, but it may supersede on occasion Jewish law. Now, one of the interesting things I found as I went through my reading on this is that if you look at most Jewish rulings by rabbis, especially as we move into the more modern era, rarely is dignity ever given as a reason why a ruling is made a certain way. And the reason is because since dignity could allow somebody to violate a law under certain circumstances, the rabbis were afraid if they started using that too often, it would come where people would start using it for everything. And they're so afraid that it would be abused that they decided they wouldn't use it much. So as I'm going to talk now about some end-of-life issues, I'm going to tell you right up front, this is my own thinking based on what I understand about how dignity operates and what I know about how Jewish law looks at some of these issues. But if you wanted to know where I got the information, nobody's really written about it because the rabbis don't really want to use this to explain what they're doing and why they're making the decisions that they're making. So the first thing I want to look at is something that I think is topical here in California now, which is assisted suicide. And is that really death with dignity? And again, I'm looking at it from a Jewish perspective. And how does Judaism look at what we might think about death with dignity? And I want to start by describing death in the Bible, because I've always found that's been very helpful to me in terms of my own work in end-of-life care. And if we look at the way people die in the Bible, we don't see a whole lot. There's very, very little written about it until at the end of the book of Genesis, we see the death of Jacob, which encompasses 3 chapters at the end of the book of Genesis, and it discusses how Joseph goes to him. He gives some of his last wishes to Joseph. He then blesses Joseph's 2 sons. Then all the sons are called in, and they all stand around his bedside. He blesses his entire family, and then the Bible says he took his legs up into his bed and he died. And if you look at any other death in the Bible, this is not recorded. Nothing like that is ever recorded. It just says he died and was gathered unto his ancestors, or if you go back even earlier, Adam died and begot sons and daughters before he died, and so how old he was. What the Bible doesn't say, we can find in 2 places in the Talmud and in what's called the Midrash, which are rabbinical stories and legends that, in a sense, help fill in gaps. And what it says there is that before Jacob's death, the way people died was they sneezed and their soul left them. In fact, that's probably the origin of why we say God bless you or something else. It comes from a Jewish source called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Jacob went to God and he said, people die suddenly. They don't get sick before they die. Wouldn't it be a good idea if you created illness before death so we have warning, and this way we have time to bless our family and take care of all of our business and tie up our loose ends before we pass away. And God said that's a great idea. You get to be the first one, and that's why Jacob's death is described in the Bible. And I use this because I always find this is really what to me, that's death with dignity. To die like the patriarch Jacob in my bed with all your children around you, you're able to talk to them, bless them, and so forth. That, I would say, we could argue, certainly you could interpret as being death with dignity. However, if you look at the next slide, in our society, death with dignity has now come, as was mentioned, to really be sort of used to describe physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and those kinds of things. And that's forbidden under Jewish law. And there's a number of sources that we use to support this. In Deuteronomy, Moses is talking to the people, and he's explaining, God has said, I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. You shall choose life so that you and your offspring will live. And this is really part of the imprimatur that we have to choose. Whenever there's a choice, we always choose to live. Ethics of the Father says, against your will you were born, against your will you will die. So again, it's not up to us to decide when we die, it's up to God to decide when we die. The death of King Saul, described at the end of the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, and the beginning of the book of 2 Samuel, is also used to illustrate some of this. King Saul was in a battle with the Philistines. The Israelites were going to lose the battle, and King Saul didn't want to be captured alive. So he asked his armor bearer to kill him, which the armor bearer refused to do. So King Saul basically fell on his sword and died. Then we go to 2 Samuel. It tells us that an Amalekite came upon King Saul's body, chopped his head off, figured, gee, I'm going to go to King David. Since they were enemies, he'll reward me and I'll be a real good place. So he takes the head, goes to King David, and tells King David not only was Saul dead, but that Saul was mortally wounded when he fell on his sword, and he asked me to end his life, and I killed him. I ended his life because he asked me to do that. And David had him taken out and executed for murder. So there are a number of things that come out of this, but one of them is even when the person is mortally wounded, to go and take that person's life is not permitted. That's one of the things we learn from that story. We go to the next slide. This is further sort of codified in a sense by Rabbi Bleich in an article that he wrote in 1996, where he explains that Judaism teaches that man has no proprietary interest either in his life or in his body. Man's body and life are not his to give away. The proprietor of all human life is none other than God himself. And there's a commentator, Radvaz, on the law in Sanhedrin 18:6, he phrases it, man's life is not his property, but the property of the Holy One, blessed be he. In other words, this idea is that our bodies don't belong to us. They belong to God, and God decides when we're born, and God decides when we die. We don't get to decide when we die, he does. Next. So, clearly it seems like it's forbidden, but I just wanted to raise this because I think it's really important to think about. Could dignity be invoked in some way to supersede Jewish law? And if you look at the current California law, for example, and you look at this, which is modeled after the law in Oregon and Washington, where the physicians are required to prescribe medication to the patient, and then the patient is required to ingest the medication him or herself. These are both active things. In other words, the doctor's actively writing the prescription, giving it to the patient's acquiring and ingesting the medication. And since these both would be violations, because they're both actively done, and you can only invoke kavod habriot, dignity, when Jewish law is passively unfulfilled, then this would also, it could not be used to override Jewish law in this circumstance, because everything's being done here is active. You're doing something active by writing the prescription, by purchasing the medication, and by taking the medication. This is the way I reasoned it. And again, I don't think anybody's written it in quite this way, but that's the way I think it would look. So we go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Gosses because Dr. Prager is going to give you a whole discussion of it. Basically, it's somebody who's actively dying. And one of the things I want to point out here is that you're not allowed to touch the person, even according to the Talmud, because there's a rabbinical source that describes the Gosses like a flickering flame. So if you ever walk by a flickering flame, it goes out immediately if you just from walking by it. And the same thing could happen here. In parlance, as I say, in hospice, what we call an actively dying person. And the reason I want to bring it up here, a couple of points, is Rabbi Moses Feinstein was one of the great 20th century rulers in end-of-life care, rabbinical rulings, says that touching does not refer to basic care needs such as cleansing and providing liquids to overcome dryness. Routine hospital procedures such as drawing blood or even taking temperature have no place in the final hours of a patient's life. And I wanted to quote this because I think that's an important illustration of where dignity comes in. Again, there's a physical dignity here by keeping the person clean. Now, he never uses the term dignity when he discusses this, but he's still telling us, even though the Talmud says you can't touch the person, certainly you can keep the patient clean. And that's how dignity operates, in part in this setting. I'm not going to go into these stories. Well, I'm going to go to Yudah Hanassi because I know Dr. Prager is going to discuss that. Briefly, Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion story. He was caught by the Romans teaching the Torah in public and was sentenced to be executed burnt at the stake, wrapped in the Torah scroll that he was using. They additionally put tufts of wool over his body that were wet to retard the flames and extend his dying, so to speak. The guard, first the students actually were forced to witness this, asked him to open your mouth, let the flames come in so you'll die more quickly. And he says, I'm not allowed to do that, which of course illustrates the point that one cannot do anything active to shorten one's life. So then the guard asked him, what if I took away the tufts of wool? The tufts of wool are only serving to impede the dying. They're serving no useful purpose, but it's an impediment to the flame consuming him. And he says, that you're permitted to do. And he says, well, if I do that, will I be rewarded in the next world? And the rabbi says, yes, you will. And he removes the tufts of wool. The rabbi is consumed by the flame. The guard jumps into the flame because he knows otherwise the emperor is going to execute him anyway, because he just committed treason. And then there's what we call in Hebrew a baskol, a voice comes down from heaven and says that both the rabbi and the guard are in the next life receiving their reward. So we learn from this, again, this idea about either passive non-action or here additionally removing impediments to dying in a sense. Things that clearly have no purpose in supporting life but are only things that are slowing the dying process. So on the next slide, just to summarize, because again you'll get a whole talk on Goses and how these things operate. You're forbidden to do anything active to hasten dying. It is permitted to not subject the Goses to interventions that will only serve to impede the dying process, or you can remove those interventions. Touching is permitted to maintain dignity of the body and so forth. So therefore, you can say, since anything you do is anything you're not doing is passive, you're just not doing something, that kavod habriot would appear to operate, dignity would appear to operate here in terms of the Goses. Now I want to move from there to non-actively dying terminally ill patients. Judaism defines terminal illness as 1 year or less, and it's a very complicated definition, which I'm not going to get into. But the point I want to make again is that withholding is permitted, again because it's passive, when the active intervention will delay the dying process or the terminally ill patients experience pain and suffering that will not be relieved by the intervention. Withdrawing, however, is more difficult. Only if it's an impediment to death and there's no life-supportive activity may one be allowed to withdraw. Anything that is life-supporting, one may not withdraw. And I think, again, I think the things I've already told you really support this. The next slide. So some of the things that you can withhold under Jewish law would be things like CPR. Again, I will tell you right up front, not every rabbi is going to agree with this. There are many traditional rabbis who say you have to do CPR no matter what. But clearly, even within traditional Judaism, there is a place and a space for which one can make a decision not to do CPR. You can choose not to place a person on a mechanical ventilator. A patient can choose, or a person can choose not to give a patient ineffective or experimental anti-cancer therapies. Those things can be either refused or withheld. Withdrawal, as I said, is much more difficult. Now, there's a concept that's coming up more and more now. I do some work in Israel, and it's really coming up there as well. This idea of continuous versus intermittent therapy. So for instance, take hemodialysis. Somebody's on dialysis and they've decided they're having a lot of other problems and they don't want to do this anymore. And since hemodialysis is a intermittent treatment, they go 2-3 times a week, they can simply decide, I'm not going again. Because they have the dialysis, it's ended. The next dialysis is considered a new treatment. and they can decide not to go. And that would be passive, and that would be something that, under certain circumstances, if they check with their rabbi might allow. A mechanical ventilator is generally forbidden to remove. Pulling the plug is generally forbidden since it is considered life supportive in nature. Now, what's happening in Israel, about 10 years ago, they passed a bill called the Dying Patient Act. It still hasn't been implemented, but they're still working on it on some of the kings. But one of the areas that they looked at was the problem of people on chronic ventilator therapy who want to have the ventilator removed because the families want them removed because the patients are not, in their minds, leading a productive quality of life. And again, there are Jews in Israel who are very traditional, and Jews who are not, and especially among the less traditional population, they want to be able to remove the ventilator, and it's been illegal in Israel to do that. So what they came up with was the idea of having a ventilator which has a timer for how long it will stay on, and for the doctor to prescribe not continuous ventilation but intermittent ventilation. In other words, patient comes in and I want to ventilate them, and I decide I want to ventilate them for 2 weeks. I want to put them on a trial ventilation for 2 weeks. During the 2 weeks, you'll know whether they're going to recover or not from whatever their problem was, more than likely. And if they do, if you can medically wean them before the 2 weeks, you go ahead and do that. If you can't, before the 2 weeks, you talk to the family, you can make a decision about, do I want to put the ventilator on after it shuts itself off, or do I not want to put the ventilator on after it shuts itself off? Now, a lot of people think, well, what's the difference? In Judaism, it makes a difference whether you're doing something active or something passive, as I've tried to illustrate. That's a big area in terms of differentiating in Jewish law, is active versus passive. So here, where we don't have those things, clearly you can't remove a Jewish patient who's traditional from a ventilator, but as the technology develops, it might come a time where there'll be a mechanism with which to do that. So to conclude this, to summarize, withholding is passive and permitted and consistent with dignity under Jewish law. Withdrawing intermittent therapy would be passive and permitted and consistent with kavod habriot, with dignity. Withdrawing continuous life support therapy is active and forbidden, as it would violate Jewish laws around preserving and extending life, and cannot be suspended for the sake of dignity under Jewish law. So I want to move to the final thing I want to talk about, which is food and fluids, which I call the exception to this. And it is and it's not. Food and fluids are considered basic care by most, certainly traditional Orthodox rabbis. I know some conservative rabbis. Others, especially when it's a little bit artificially, see it more as a medical intervention, which would put it under the rubric of you could withhold it under certain circumstances. So, but in a traditional point of view, from the Orthodox viewpoint, even when provided artificially, it's not considered a medical intervention. It's considered providing a basic human need to the patient. Now, this especially comes up in neurodegenerative disease patients. And one of the important things, which again, I don't have time to go into in depth, is that primary neurological conditions such as dementia and similar things are not considered terminal under Jewish law. Now, if you look at, for example, here in the United States, at advanced directives talk about terminal condition or an irreversible neurological condition. So very often under secular law in most states, they equate irreversible neurological conditions, such as advanced dementias and things of that nature, with terminal illness, even though they're not necessarily terminal. And with feeding and good supportive care, you can keep people alive, and very often in those conditions, for years. And therefore, from the rabbinical viewpoint, the choice not to feed such patients may result in their death, and they would see that death as directly due to the lack of food and fluid, as opposed to others, I've heard you might interpret as, well, the patient can be offered a tray, but they're physically unable to eat. And that's why it's okay not to provide it. From a traditional perspective, that doesn't work, because it's really felt to be that even if it's artificial, it's still a basic need and not being provided for a medical intervention. And as I thought about this, I think we'll go to the last slide. I thought about this. I came to the conclusion that perhaps really dignity is operating in this situation. Kavod habriot is really operating. Because remember what we're talking about. We're talking about a basic human need is food and fluid. And again, this is in a non-terminally ill patient from a Jewish perspective, even though we might not see it quite the same way. And whether this human being, however this human being is functioning, we have to remember they're a human being. And since they're a human being and they're created in the image of God, they're entitled to basic human needs. One of those needs, or two, being food and fluid. So in this case, at least from a traditional viewpoint, one might be able to argue that passively not providing fluid would violate the Jewish concept of dignity, because this is a human being, despite their condition, and this is a basic human need to make sure that they're fed and given enough fluid. Now, as I said, not everybody's going to agree with this. This is something, as I was going through the literature, I came upon me because I really felt that's probably part of why this is the way it is. It's probably the most important barrier to traditional Jews entering hospice, especially with neurodegenerative diseases. They're afraid that they're not going to be given food and fluid, and that they're going to die not of their disease, but die of not being fed and hydrated. So that's why I bring it up this way, and I think, again, we frame it in that context of dignity. I think we can see it in a different way that might help make more sense in terms of why we do this. Thank you.